Yeah,
We are
Uber
now
conference
live
pretty
on
bad.
YouTube. This is the December 19th meeting of the Node.js modules team. We have 12 people on the call right now, and we got a pretty full agenda, so we're going to jump right into it. First item on the agenda today is issue number 230. This is an issue that was opened by Jeffrey, who I do not believe is with us today. And it's specifically about trying to figure out how we can organize work and structure work within the group. And in fact, Jeffrey has just joined us. So perhaps, Jeffrey, would you like to lead the discussion around number 230, which is discussing organizing work?
Hey, sure. This doesn't need to be that big of a thing. I was just thinking that if we had some kind of scratch pad or wiki page or something to say who was working on what. I've been with some wonderful people working on some of the phase 2 items, I think 2-3. And it started out as like being kind of a mess in Google Hangouts, and we've been shifting to try to get something set up in Slack. So that's something else that we could maybe broaden out to beyond just the group that I've been working with, if that's something of interest to people.
I guess like one of my first thoughts on this would be like, Node as a whole throughout the whole project is pretty like decentralized and decoupled, and it's kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, a bit of a duocracy. Show up and do the work and it gets done. And we haven't really had this problem where we need such like an explicit sign up for who's working on what. Now, perhaps because of the breadth that we need to do here, that may be necessary, but is it something we can enforce? Is it something that it's like, if your name's not on that list, you're not allowed to work on it? Or if your name's on the list, you have to include everyone who's on the list to do any work? I'm not sure that kind of management style will be very effective with the way in which people within Node itself work. That's kind of my initial reaction to it. But, process evolves over time, and we're a newer group with different collaborators, so we may have different needs. But I want to just, like, my gut is ensuring that whatever we do is something that's scalable and something we can actually commit to. So, like, Jeff, what are you imagining would be like the commitment that such a document would be creating?
So we already had that comment from the phase 2 PR where I just said, like, who wants to work on what, add a comment or edit my comment. And then it's just like, it's really, that's all it is. It's just like a statement of, these are the people interested, not necessarily interested in working, but just interested in that piece of the implementation. And I think the expectation was like, please try to like include them in some way, like maybe at them when you post a PR or something, or if you're scheduling a meeting to talk about efforts for that, consider inviting them. It's not like a mandated thing. It's not a requirement. It's not meant to be, these people have to work on it or what. Like a lot of the people don't have time to commit writing any code, but it's more of just like a way to express interest, because a lot of us have very little time. So like the people who don't have time to write code or commit a lot of time for other things, it's easy to forget that, like, oh yeah, that person wanted to, be somewhat involved or aware of what's going on with that piece of the implementation. So just a place to put that information, I was thinking. But if I'm the only one, then we don't have to do it. So.
Wes has their hand up. Wes, would you like to add something?
So this is Daniel. Just a quick. So is it more kind of like a statement of interest over specific topics and things like that? Is that the idea?
Yeah, that was what I was intending. I mean, it seems like we're kind of defaulting into forming little working groups to implement dynamic modules, to implement the package exports, et cetera. And so at that point, it becomes a kind of inherently a little more semi-formalized, but at minimum, it would just be, a statement to the group of like, these are the people interested in these things to, if you like to include them, such as for the purpose of going to the next step of trying to write an implementation, then you know who to talk to about trying to find people to help you write the code, people to test it, etc.
Got it. Makes perfect sense.
Okay, so I guess, Kevin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I don't have specific recommendations for how to structure things any better, but I am having a little bit of trouble understanding the directions that people are working on. I think the phases document is a great starting point for trying to understand the work that different people are doing. So that before this meeting, I took a look at that, and that was helpful and kind of framing everything in my mind. But I still feel like people are going off and doing work, and it's hard for me to understand what the goals of various groups are, and then what what the deliverable is at the end. Like we've figured out that this is the way we want to do it, and here's the implementation, and that's that? Or is it more like, okay, here's our recommendation, here's the pros, here's the cons, and here's some other alternatives we considered, so that might be something to consider too. But like I said, I don't have a specific recommendation.
I mean, I'm thinking, what I was thinking initially was a wiki page where we could put that stuff. We could put it on the roadmap document itself and have some kind of rules about what kind of edits are allowed on that without quorum. Like maybe adding and removing names for the list of people interested in each thing could be done without quorum or something, but no other changes or something like that. I don't know.
I know that Salah had mentioned, and I think this may not be a bad idea either, is a project board. Because we can use a project board, we could create kind of like, I guess it's a column for each of the various phases or specific features that we're working on. We could create notes in there to keep track of progress, as well as active participants, as well as active issues that have to do with that particular bit.
Sure.
Rob, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I think the two things, like having focus groups, I can see how that leads to progress, and I think overall that's a good thing. The two things that I'd like to maintain with that is, number one is kind of like a centralized index, where you can, from there you can link to where all the work is happening, and I think that's probably our phases document. And then the other thing is that when the results are brought back and presented to the group, it should still be a full coherent story, and no skipping over like the rationale and so on.
That makes a lot of sense. We have 1 more minute left for this agenda item. Anyone else have anything to raise or talk about here?
Do we want to maybe see if we have consensus about starting a project board? Maybe we could see how that goes.
Yeah, I also think I don't think we really need consensus to start documenting those things unless anyone objects on the repo. But does anyone object to moving forward with making a project board to track some of this stuff more explicitly? All right, cool. I'd say we're good to move forward on that then. Does anybody want to take the action item? Don't all volunteer at once, please.
Don't you have to do it, Miles, or because you're the admin on the repo?
Anyone can start a project board, as far as I know. I'm pretty busy the next 2 weeks with holiday stuff, so I won't have a ton of time. If I can find time, I'll kick it off and start getting things going. If anyone else feels like taking some initiative,
I can lead it if you want. Maybe if Salah has time, we can divide the work, something like that.
All right, that'd be great. Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay,
the next agenda item that we have is dynamic module development in Node. It's issue number 24894, and I believe that this is also connected to dynamic modules number 11, which we could see as a reference within the agenda here. I guess this may be a good thing for either Guy or Brad to lead. Do either of you have a preference?
So I have a minor preference to lead, just because I feel like the current discussion on these is actually a procedural one more than a implementation or logistical one.
Okay. And then JDD, I know you were heavily involved, but you mentioned that you're at the airport. Is it safe to assume that you're going to probably be communicating through chat?
Yeah, I may, or I may pop in, depending on connection and all of that. So we'll be able to. If not, Kevin's there too. So
okay, great. If you write any messages, I will keep my eye on the chat and I will proxy any of your comments during this discussion, if that helps.
Thanks.
Okay, Brad, take it away. We have on the agenda, I think it's 15 minutes for this, but I think if we need to, we could definitely extend it.
So this issue, and more importantly to me, this PR came about after we actually went and implemented, well, I should say Guy implemented this spec that we're trying to produce for dynamic modules. This is not a theoretical thing. This is kind of a response to implementation, and we encountered something that was controversial to a variety of parties for a variety of reasons. And so in the past, the way we've actually managed to make progress is not by making mandates that a feature must exist. The way we're making progress right now is to agree upon a minimal set of things and iterating and finding the proper way to solve features ad hoc. To that end, this PR came about as something where we were removing a feature that is problematic or controversial, whatever you want to call it. It has overall effects on the system. If we include it, this PR doesn't really prevent from happening in the future. So it's basically just reserving future design space by removing something that's controversial. And so it seems like in these discussions, we're making mandates that we can't remove something, when quite the opposite of that, the ways we've actually managed to agree as a group are by removing things and then working back towards adding things that were removed. So I really do feel like we should land this PR, even if we end up reverting it next month. If we revert it next week, that's great. Nobody is arguing that we shouldn't have this export star from syntax. That's not really what's being argued about. It's about, hey, we got some feedback. This is considered controversial. We want to keep momentum. We're going to remove the controversy and put it off into a separate effort. This is what we've done for a variety of things. This is what we've been doing with the minimal kernel. This is what we're doing by approaching things as separate phased items. We're not trying to tackle everything at once because this entire module system topic has so much overlap that we are unable to reach consensus if we do that. So I really want to land this because it's getting rid of the controversy and we can work on actual implementation details, while people interested in the controversial bits can work on that separately rather than affecting the entire effort of this dynamic module spec. Does that make sense? So I'm basically saying when we're going through these PRs, doing this organized work, I want to keep the momentum, and I feel like these have gotten derailed from the ways we've managed to gain momentum. So I do want to land these.
Jordan, you have your hand up?
Yeah, the objections I'm seeing on the PR are objections of the kind I've had in the past, which were basically we should not, like, I find it unacceptable to ship without this support. And the consensus we reached in the group was that we don't need to be at that level because no one is anywhere close to proposing shipping an unflagged implementation yet. And so with any change, it is important to note what future work needs to be done on it. So as has been indicated in the chat, like, clearly we need to do future work on export star from as it relates to CJS in order to answer questions about what we do next. But merging something that removes functionality or breaks people or whatever now, to me, is irrelevant, because the purpose is to make progress. We're not maintaining an API here. And if anyone's depending on this functionality, my personal opinion is they deserve to get broken. I mean, I would be fine with, like, using the SHA of the commit as the API name so that it breaks them every commit if necessary. Nobody should be relying on the stability of this feature. And then separately, like, I think that blocking progress because it's not good enough yet to unflag is something that we all as a group already agreed not to do. So I would really like to see this PR land with the very obvious and already established point that this needs to be addressed long before unflagging. That's it.
Thank you, Jordan. Jeffrey, you have your hand up.
Sorry, I don't have an opinion on the underlying issue. I was just going to say, reading this long thread definitely made me think, wow, I really hope that these folks, like, schedule a meeting soon. I don't think we have enough time in this meeting to go through all this. But yeah, I understand Bradley's frustration about having to wait until January, but it feels to me like everyone involved needs to just have a good long hour or 2 hour meeting to hash out all these issues when everyone's available to talk about it. That's how it seems to me, at least from reading.
So I have a response to that. The topics being discussed in the comment thread are not related to actually the spec. They're related to loss of a feature. And the loss of the feature is exactly because of a controversy. I don't see how having another meeting is going to tie us back to the spec when we can't talk about the spec in this comment thread at all. The vast majority of these comments are just about not wanting to ship without a feature. And nobody's saying we must
I don't think it's quite that simple. I think it's more like it's discussing the general order of work. Like, we do this now, and then we have to revert, and then we add this other thing, and that, it's not just like here.
Jeffrey and Brad, there's a couple people with hands up before you kind of get too
anyway,
deep.
This is derailed. We don't have to talk about this anymore.
Kevin, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I've spoken a lot with JDD about this, so I kind of understand his point of view, I think. But backing up just a little bit, I like what Jeffrey said. I think, I think that, when we all get time together, we should get together and just talk about our different concerns. Like, we don't have to make this, a controversial big, big line in the sand kind of thing right here, right now. It's not really a good time for that. We should just, take a couple steps back, and then the first week of January, we can sort this out. And, I'm confident that we can. So yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Salah?
Yeah, so like I'm also going with the same inclination towards finding a way to actually discuss things, but I think the one aspect that I would like to kind of propose that we try harder at is to appreciate that, yeah, there might be a disagreement on the action item, but that does not mean that the words or the perspectives involved in that disagreement are, one or the other is right. Or in other words, trying to appreciate the points of the other person, the way they are trying to actually frame it, could be all it takes to convince them that the discussion is actually going in a way that eases their own concern. Just focusing on the particular action item and considering opposing views or views that have opposing clues or hints in them, just to be opposite to what you're trying to do, I think closes the door for people to become easily convinced. So it's just a matter of recognizing the different perspectives. And sorry, it took a little bit longer.
Bradley?
So I want to loop back kind of after hearing those comments. Once again, I think this is a procedural thing. We've managed to have momentum because we've been able to separate out controversial parts, even if we don't want to ship them. I don't think people want to ship the minimal kernel, but we were able to agree upon it and build upon it, and it's not so controversial anymore. And so we're able to focus on these phases and things. And I don't want these pull requests to be bogged down in the same way. I want this pull request in particular to land because it separates a controversial bit from what we're actually having implemented right now, because we don't know what we're going to implement for something. And so making a forwards path for people to work on that is great. It's a way for us to talk about it. But blocking people from actually making a forwards path, blocking them from moving forward with their proposals because of a controversial feature, and refusing to let them move that controversial feature into a separate discussion from other parts of the proposal, is just going to block the whole proposal. Like, let's step back a bit. Jordan said he doesn't want to ship anything without the syntax. That's fine. But if we take that at its core, the way we've approached all these problems is to remove controversy. If dynamic modules become controversial, such as we find for some reason it's unacceptable to ship export start from, that doesn't mean we keep it with export start from. That means we remove the entire feature. And so instead of letting this feature evolve and have separate sub-features that we're able to work on, that we're able to polish, we're trying to remove the entire feature by saying we don't want to land this PR, in my mind. Because we're refusing to let us agree upon anything because of absolutes. And the absolutes here are basically that we have to never land stuff that we're not going to revert, which I totally want to land stuff that we're allowed to revert. We can make mistakes. I want us to feel comfortable reverting this PR. But I'm seeing kind of the opposite in discussions. People don't want to land things that we're going to revert. And I feel like that's going to stop our momentum. And I absolutely do not want that. Also, we have a deadline here a bit. If we're going to go talk to TC39 about this, we have until January 18th. We have deadlines for all of this. Constantly pushing things back, this PR is 11 days old. It's going to be around a month old.
So, hey, okay, wait a minute now. You know, we've said like that we can circle back on this and, you know, reach consensus on it between all the parties in the first week of January. Like that leaves us plenty of time. So
we haven't scheduled that, and it's going to be hard for me to schedule that. So we're going to be pushing.
I think for 1 second, y'all. Sorry, John had put up his hand to talk when Brad started. So before you two kind of dig into stuff, I would like to give JDD a chance to speak.
Hi. All right. So if I cut out, then I cut out. So I see, much like Jordan, this feature is kind of a requirement for the scope of the goal of transparent interop. It's one of the driving forces of a reason to have transparent interop in the first place. So to me, it's like it's cutting out critical functionality. And my concern is that in cases, there have been cases where we can go to like a minimal core, but there's still an expectation of functionality there. And here, if we consider this to be something that adds complexity to the spec, then I think cutting it out and then trying to revisit it after we've moved forward in a given direction is going to be more painful than just trying to resolve it up front and come up with a way that handles it at the start instead of trying to back it in later and rework everything from the base. So like, for example, if the issue here is complexities, then we should take it to the TC39. They'll say, hey, you know what, this adds too much complexity to the spec. It tightly couples dynamic modules with the abstract module record and adds a lot of overhead to the ECMA 262. And then with them, we could work on simplifying that or coming up with a different approach. What I want is to give time for us to work on that approach before starting to cut core and like required functionality for a feature and then going down a path that we'll get too far down before we're able to work our way out of it for like an alternative approach. So that's my main concern, is that since this is pretty critical to transparent interop and the feature as a whole, I don't think it's a candidate for being cut. I think it's a candidate for being really, really worked on to make sure we can solve this thing. Because if we can't solve that thing, to me, it really nixes the feature as a whole. So that's why I don't think this is something that we can just fluff off the top, and we should work on it.
JDD, quickly, we have hit our time on this agenda item. I just want to suggest something quickly, and then Brad, I know you had your hand up, but we can extend the time if people want. It seems to me like perhaps like what I'm hearing is from some individuals like, hey, we need to land this to start working on the solution for the problem that people are pointing out. Other individuals are saying, hey, like this entire thing may be a non-starter if this doesn't work properly. Now, if this landed with like the express contract that if another solution could be brought that solves this problem, that it would be reverted, or alternatively, if it cannot be solved, it would be reverted. Is there any benefit to waiting 2 weeks versus landing it now? Like JDD, does that appease any of your concern if we like make consensus right now on that agreement?
Sorry, I'm finding the unmute button. So that's something that wasn't really discussed, and I was thinking about that too. Like, what if we add the qualifications to this thing that says, like, hey, this can be reverted, and this should be reverted, or like solving this is a requirement for the feature as a whole. Puts the right level of importance on it, just because I can't see the driving force of transparent interop here, making it to where we lose transparent interop for this goal. So yeah, I think that would help. I don't know what Kevin thinks. For me, sure, having something like that. That's what we did with unambiguous grammar initially in Node as well. We tried it out, and we had that caveat in the documentation that said, like, hey, if we can't resolve the open issues with TC39, then it reverts, right? And
so
and that worked out.
So very specifically, what if we added to phase 2 solving this problem? Would that appease your concerns in a way that's documented?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this work is actually being done for phase 2.
But I'm saying we have quorum in the room, and we could reach consensus that for phase 2 to be complete, that we need to solve this hanging issue.
I mean, sure.
I'm just trying to find a way to document what like the kind of agreement and contract that we're having right now, and trying to figure out where to put it so that it's obvious, it's easy to find, and we're not having a disagreement in the future.
Okay, I'm not really picky on where it lives. If it lives in the actual dynamic modules proposal, which is where I guess it would make sense, or if you anchor it to another piece to, since it is kind of critical, then that makes sense too. So I'm loose though. So talk to someone else with stronger opinions.
Okay, and then if people don't mind, I'm going to quickly just ask a couple questions to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Kevin, do you have any concerns with this approach?
No, that sounds good. And I think it probably should be added to the phase 2 thing, phase 2 items.
Okay, great. Jordan, you have your hand up. You had your hand up. Was that resolved, or do you still have something to add?
Yeah, just I very much agree that this should be documented. And to me, it's quite clear that it is already a requirement among the group. So I'm in full support of that.
Great. Brad, any other concerns or thoughts you'd want to add?
I don't want an absolute mandate that we refuse to ship without that feature, but I'm fine with a strong investigation. However strong you want to be, it could be brutal, but
to be clear, I'm if we don't ship with transparent interop, then it's non-transparent interop. And that's, that to me is a livable outcome as well. But I rather have, if we have transparent interop, which is my preference, I rather have it than have just a not a full transparent interop, right? So that's my bit. So worst case, we have non-transparent interop, and that's just the path that we go down. So
yeah.
For me, that's the fallback. It's like, if we can't do this, then to a satisfactory thing level, then we just fall back to the non-transparent interop and move forward with that.
Sounds good. I like that.
Okay, so with that being said, do we have consensus here? Does anyone object to landing Guy? Oh, actually, Guy, is there anything you would like to add? As it's your PR.
Nothing I can verbalize.
Okay, that's fair. Do we have any objections to landing Guy's pull request now, under the assumption that we will document in phase 2?
Sorry, can you just clarify that, Miles?
We will document in our roadmap that we will be exploring the space of export star and coming up with a solution. Otherwise, we would be open. We would look at reverting the dynamic module stuff.
Like, to me, that is not going to work because no, look, okay, it's fine. Look, basically, I think what it comes down to is, if at the end of this process, it can well turn out that we don't go forward with dynamic modules because of these concerns. And if that's the case, what then concerns me is going back on transparent interop. And if that's the case, then the single concern will have successfully achieved both of those goals. And that to me is not at all ideal. I think it's pretty much certain that it will not be possible to fix this case. No one wants to discuss the details with me. People keep putting it off. That's fine. But I've also specifically asked people to share valid use cases for this. And not a single person's been able to provide me with an example of an actual use case for this feature that suddenly everyone wants. I asked at the last meeting, is everyone okay with this? And we had quorum that everyone was okay with it. And then suddenly one person makes one comment when TC39 had full agreement on it. And suddenly the whole process can derail. And I just do not understand how that is possible. And I personally find it incredibly demoralizing that I can spend so much time on something for one person to make one comment and that entire direction of work to be basically derailed, because there is no way that this can be merged into ECMA 262 without at least a full page of spec devoted to dynamic modules, which means that would need to be done. It would need to be produced into spec material, and it would need to be put into ECMA 262. It would need to rewrite abstract module records and the way they work. That'll only be possible 6 months down the line. This means that modules land without dynamic module support. And that's fine if that's what we've achieved. But then if we're going to put a prerequisite on that if this gets reverted, then we're going to reconsider transparent interop, then all of the directions that we've gone down are basically, and that's fine. If that's what people are looking to achieve, then they will successfully achieve it. But the two things is, one, I would really value a single use case example of why this is suddenly so important. And two, could someone please actually discuss the technical details at some point and put some thought and time into it? Because it feels like people are talking around the issue and no one's actually diving into it.
So I think Bradley did a scan and showed usage in the wild. This is native syntax. This is syntax that's used by people writing and assuming transparent interop today, which is that's the use case. It's out there in the wild today. Devs have an expectation with their transparent interop hat on of this working. Without this feature, then all of a sudden they have to care about the parse goal of the thing they're requiring, or we push work onto the devs, which is pushing work on millions of devs versus
Can you explain
taking the time
what work
to
you're pushing
to
onto
work
people?
on
Because I'm really not hearing concrete
because
examples.
the suggestion is that we have
single code
transpilers
example,
fix it.
please.
We have
Guy, JDD.
devs fix it. Yeah.
We've got Brad's hand up and
Oh,
a
sorry.
couple people with hands as well.
Yep. I'll step back.
So since my name was first, I just want to say the scan I did actually doesn't really show heavy usage. Also, most of the usage is behind a transpiler permanently. So I don't think it's a compelling argument to use my scan about stuff unless we actually go and discuss what the metrics mean. And we can do that elsewhere.
Your scan showed thousands of uses
John?
of the syntax, and 30% were without transpilation, which is still a significant number.
No, those 30% are still using Babel for the most part.
Well, that's our audience here. This is
John and Brad. Can you please both not interrupt each other and let people who have their hands up speak? Brad, did you have anything more to add there?
Just that we should take all talks of those scans elsewhere.
Okay. Jeremiah?
Yeah, okay. I have two things. Number one is that I really disagree that that is necessarily our audience for dynamic modules. I think a lot of our audience for dynamic modules in the end is people who are unable to switch at the current time still, and that will come down the line later. So I'm not sure if judging by what's out there in transpiled code is necessarily the be all and end all. I quite think the opposite. The other thing is, I think a road where, because this ultimately small part of what you can do with importing things is not able to be implemented, and so maybe dynamic modules are reverted, and then we want to back dynamic, not dynamic modules as in the spec, but dynamic modules as in CommonJS interop out of Node, I think is unacceptable.
Okay, I had my hand up for after Jeremiah, and kind of two thoughts that I have on here. First is, as far as I know, and someone throw up your hand and correct me if I'm wrong, CommonJS is not going to be the only goal that will require dynamic modules. I believe, but I could be wrong, that if we have WebAssembly modules, those may not be able to be statically analyzed. They might be. I'm not sure how that works, but similar dynamic module records may be necessary for those. Other future goals that may come in the future may require them as well. So, trying to find a solution here to the space that solves it is kind of a bigger problem than just Node. Guy, do you have something to say that talks to that?
Yeah, I can just clarify that. So WebAssembly modules are implemented as their own module records, just like dynamic modules is its own module record. And these are all based on the same abstract module record. The spec for WebAssembly modules has currently been drafted, And it's we were having discussions at one point about seeing if there was a shared base, but rather what we've gone ahead with is just making these separate module records. And dynamic modules, you can think of them maybe as programmatic modules whose exports are only known at execution time. They have a kind of a programmatic population. And the key constraint of programmatic exports population is you don't know what it exports until it executes. So you can do everything. You can do named exports and all these things. But if you want to write export star from dynamic module, we can't do the static validations of export star that happen at instantiation time, not execution time, where you have to do things like check if you have two export star statements next to each other. If they both export the same name, there's supposed to be an ambiguous error that's thrown during instantiation. So there's a clash. We don't know if it clashes until we execute it. So that whole clash process has to be done differently. And so it's those kind of complexities. But in every case where someone's doing export star, it's usually possible to just replace it with a common JS module that does module that exports equals, because you're on a common JS boundary. So, but sorry, I was getting off there. I'll let you continue on.
Yeah. So I think that perhaps based on the conversation that we're having right now, perhaps we should separate the discussion about transparent interop and dynamic modules, and perhaps a better way of phrasing it than if dynamic modules ends up if we can't reach consensus on the implementation, that I think that it's less that we wouldn't be doing transparent interop and more dynamic modules wouldn't be the way we do transparent interop, because we could still explore other models. I don't know that there are any, but I just think to the point that Jeremiah was saying, perhaps language that makes it such a finality isn't really helping the cause of building consensus around this. Does anyone else have anything to add? John, I know you were maybe having trouble putting your hand up. Was there something you wanted to add?
No, that your point is exactly correct, or I'm on the same page as that. Yeah, just because dynamic modules may not be the path for transparent interop doesn't mean there's not other ways to do it. I'm a big fan of trying it till it works and having it at some way, if that's out of the spec space, in a loader, in user land, with hooks, all these different ways to do it, then great.
Okay.
But yeah. So,
then and I guess one more thing to kind of raise here, and as a group, we've done a really good job of making sure we have consensus for everything. But we also need to accept that, for example, with something like dynamic modules, and dynamic modules being something that we're talking about bringing to TC39, having implemented MV8, and requires consensus around a whole bunch of different groups. I guess maybe this is an interesting question to pose to the group. It doesn't sound like we are anywhere close to consensus in that being able to implement export star would definitely mean that it's being removed. And if that were to be something that ends up getting pushed to a vote, as I imagine, eventually there will be a couple things that we will have to do so. Like JD, kind of to ask you a very pointed question, what would be your feelings on something like that going to a vote and finding out that the majority of the group is okay with that concession?
If the goal is transparent interop, I would feel pretty lousy about it. I think it just depends on how we scope our expected outcomes and our desired result. What do we want to achieve? For with my dev hat on, I'm thinking, dynamic modules is a way for me to have as close to the dev experience that I have today with a Babel transpiler. I can do named exports. I can do export star. I can interact with this common JS file like I do today inside an ESM module, to where I don't have to think about am I consuming a common JS file or an ESM module. But if we scope that out and to something else, and this dynamic modules means something else, then we'll have to go down that road and discuss that. So if discuss it with the whole meeting dev expectations, and with that through my view, no, I wouldn't. I don't think it can. I don't think it can make it. But if we change what it means, then maybe. Sure.
Okay, and Guy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. And just in the worst case scenario, if dynamic modules get shelved and we don't get them into the implementation in time, I want to be very clear that I'm still think it's very important that we're able to move forward with transparent interop. And I think it would be a bad outcome if this would change attitudes on transparent interop, or if it would result in the entire implementation being delayed by months. And I think those are two bad scenarios that we want to avoid in terms of how we approach dynamic modules. So ideally, I would like to approach this from the perspective of if we're not going to get dynamic modules, then can we agree that we're going to still be able to consider transparent interop equally? And secondly, that we're going to still move forward with implementation work and not allow this to delay implementation work further.
So let me propose one more thing and see if we can reach consensus around this today. That we land the work that Guy has been doing and explore the space of export start to try and find a solution to that problem. With the caveat, which we will document, that if we cannot find a solution for export star, then we will revisit this conversation to reach consensus within the group about whether or not we want to revert dynamic modules. And so I think that that's less specific, but it's just kind of like, hey, let's deal with that when we get there.
Can we please make sure that we commit to resolving this discussion before the TC39 meeting so that it doesn't cause unnecessary delay?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. Guy, or JD, would either of you like the action item of kind of documenting this, or would you like me to kind of run with it because it just came out of my mouth?
Be happy for you to run with it, unless JDB wants to rephrase it.
Well, I mean, like if you want to have like a tie-in to your proposal, I mean, it's Guy's proposal, or he's the champion of it. If there's going to be wording changes, that would probably be a PR to that proposal. I'm not quite sure the process for that. But if it's mentioned inside the phases doc, is that something that we can just do PRs too? I wouldn't mind, Miles, if you, since you're kind of away from it, like you're not in the middle of either side. That sounds like to me a good way to do it. Okay,
so what I would like to propose as a plan, just because of timing here, I will open a PR against the phases doc, and because we have quorum right now, how about we just reach consensus that if that PR is open for a week with no objections, we just land it. Does anyone object to that? Great. And does anyone object to landing Guy's PR today, under the assumption of goodwill that we will be documenting this?
Just wait a minute. So if you say a week on that, that's assuming that everyone's going to be working on this problem, over the next week. I don't know if that's a fair assumption, given the time of year it is.
Kevin, that was a week for the PR against the documentation of this.
Oh yeah, super.
And so the idea would be that I'm proposing is I will open that change to our doc and our phases. We'll leave it open for a week before landing it, just to make sure that people who aren't on the meeting have a chance to see it. And then we would go ahead with landing Guy's PR today and begin with that work for our next meeting to see if we can get, I guess, closer to some sort of understanding around export star.
Gotcha.
Does that work with you, Kevin?
Yep, it does.
Okay. Guy and Brad, are there any concerns with what I've proposed?
That sounds great.
Okay, excellent. Y'all, that was a tough one. Thank you all for sticking through it. And thank you everyone for putting in super hard work. We have 5 minutes in the meeting left. We have 2 agenda items that we did not get into, specifically around the specific import file specifier resolution proposal, and the add package export proposal. But I'd like to suggest that we wrap the meeting early, just because, you know, we've settled all the things and I don't think we have enough time to really dig into either of them. Are people okay with ending the meeting early?
I was just thinking that it could be nice maybe for Guy to give an update about the progress for that because he has an implementation. And then Miles, do you mind telling us when the next meeting is going to be?
Okay, sure. That works for me. Guy, do you want to do like a quick kind of like 2-minute overview of what you've been working on?
Sure, I can give a very brief update. I mean, it's not really anything that I was sort of presenting to the group explicitly. I sent a few PRs around, but basically just following up on that exports proposal and file import specifier proposal. The two specs that we have against the ECMAScript modules repo, there's the two PRs there. Basically just putting some implementation work together, implementing those specs as written, and at least getting to a place where we can play around with these implementations and see how they behave. And certainly not set in stone on any of this stuff at this point. And if anyone's interested in trying it out, please feel free to clone that branch, run it, and maybe in future meetings we can discuss better ways to kind of how we're going to approach sharing implementation and gathering feedback on that and building it back into the spec revision process.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Guy. As far as our next meeting, I have a meeting on the calendar right now for January 2nd is our next date based on our rolling meetings. Does anybody have any concerns with the second? I personally will actually not be able to attend, unfortunately. But I see no reason to cancel the meeting.
I'm hoping to start to get at least some of the stuff that Guy's been working on and that I've been working on, like maybe the spec proposals or something, to start to get that ready for consensus, if not by the next meeting, then the meeting after, but hopefully the next meeting.
Okay, I would like to request then, just for what it's worth, that around those proposals, I would very much like to be part of the conversations where we reach consensus around it.
Okay.
So, you know, like, let's kick back to the issue tracker. If we want to reschedule that Wednesday's meeting as a one-off, we can definitely try to do that if we can reach a form around it. Otherwise, you can run the meeting. And I mean, genuinely as well.
Well, we could also just